The camera slowly floats through a dark, damp stone corridor, lit only by a few scattered torches. The only sounds are the dripping of water and the distant, monotonous drone of monastic chanting. The year is 1278, and we are in the heart of a monastery prison in Ancona, a place designed for oblivion. An iron door creaks open, and a beam of light cuts through the gloom, revealing the figure of an old man. This is Roger Bacon. He's 64, but he looks closer to 80. His long, gray beard is matted. His monk's habit is worn to rags. But his eyes, beneath his bushy brows, his eyes burn with an unbroken, feverish fire. It is the gaze of a man who has seen what others could not even imagine. Before us stands Dr. Mirabilis, the wonderful doctor, the greatest mind of his century. A man who, in the pages of his treatises, described the principles of a flying machine 700 years before the Wright brothers, a self-propelled carriage 600 years before Carl Benz, and who, long before Columbus, argued that the earth was round and that one could reach India by sailing west. And this man, whose mind soared into the centuries to come, has already spent a year in this stone cage, sentenced to silence and oblivion. It is here, at this point of absolute ruin, that the central dramatic paradox of his life is born, the main question of our story. How? How could a prophet, able to see beyond the horizon of time, find himself trapped in the darkest of presents? Why was a monk, who dedicated his life to seeking divine truth through understanding the world, condemned by his own brothers as a dangerous heretic? To answer this question, we must return to the very beginning, to the world that gave birth to this titan of thought, a world that both craved knowledge and was terrified of it. This is not just a story of genius and its tragedy. This is a story of the eternal war between the future and the present, between free thought and dogma, a war whose echo has not faded to this day. To understand how the mind of one man could become a threat to an entire civilization, one must first understand that world. 13th century Europe was not the monolithic Dark Ages it is often portrayed as, but a boiling cauldron in which the fates of empires, religions, and ideas were being forged. Imagine a giant chessboard. On one end, a weakened but still powerful Byzantium, the last fragment of the Roman Empire, bleeding from the attacks of both the West and the East. On the other, the Catholic world, led by the Pope in Rome, whose power stretched from the icy fjords of Norway to the scorching deserts of Sicily. This Europe had just survived the fever of the Crusades, which, though failing in their main goal, had punched a hole in the wall between the Christian and Islamic worlds. And through this breach, a staggering flood of knowledge poured into the West, threatening to turn everything upside down. From the great libraries of Cordoba, Baghdad, and Damascus, translations of works that Europe had almost forgotten arrived in the scriptoriums of monasteries and the lecture halls of the new universities of Oxford, Paris, and Bologna. The logic and metaphysics of Aristotle, the medicine of Avicenna, the astronomy of Ptolemy, and most importantly for our story, the revolutionary Book of Optics by the Arab genius Ibn al-Haytham, known as Al-Hazan. This knowledge was like fire. It could provide warmth and light, but it could also burn the established order to the ground. The Church, accustomed to being the sole source of truth, suddenly faced a powerful competitor, Greek rationalism and Arab experimental science. At the same time, a new, almost apocalyptic threat was looming from the east, the Mongol Empire. The hordes of Genghis Khan and his descendants had swept across Asia and Eastern Europe, and rumors of their fury and invincibility sowed panic and terror. In this world, standing on the brink of great change and great catastrophe, where faith desperately tried to subdue reason, and the fear of the apocalypse coexisted with a thirst for new discoveries, Roger Bacon was destined to be born, a man who, like no other, embodied all the contradictions of this turbulent age. Every great river begins with a small spring, and the origins of Roger Bacon's fate are to be found in the fertile lands of Ilchester, in the county of Somerset, England, where he was born around the year 1214. He came from a wealthy noble family, and this fact is not merely a biographical detail, but the first stone in the foundation of his future tragedy. His family's wealth meant that young Roger never knew hardship. It opened the doors to the best educational institutions of his time and allowed him from an early age to devote himself to the one thing that truly captivated him: books and knowledge. While his peers were learning to wield a sword and manage estates, he was immersing himself in Latin, Greek, and mathematics. This background gave him not only resources, but also a certain intellectual aristocracy, a confidence in his own rightness, and a disdain for those he considered his intellectual inferiors. He was used to the world giving him everything he asked for. However, this same wealth cast a long shadow over him. Later, when he decided to join the Franciscan Order, taking a vow of absolute poverty, his noble birth would become a source of constant suspicion. To many of his brother monks, who came from humble backgrounds, he would forever remain an outsider, an aristocrat playing at being a holy man. His expensive pursuits, buying rare manuscripts, commissioning lenses and astrolabes for his experiments, would provoke not admiration, but envy and misunderstanding. How could a monk, who had renounced the world, spend hundreds of pounds, a fortune at the time, on strange instruments and books written in the languages of infidels? Thus, the very advantage that allowed him to become a great scholar turned into a stigma that prevented him from ever truly belonging in the environment he had chosen for himself. He was a black sheep, too smart to be a knight, and too noble by birth to be a beggar monk. This internal conflict, this mismatch between his roots and his calling, would follow him his entire life, undermining his position from within and giving his enemies a convenient excuse to accuse him of hypocrisy and pride. The era in which Bacon came of age was permeated by a sense of an impending end and great change, as if the world was holding its breath before the final battle between good and evil. The air was electrified with prophecies and omens, and the most influential of these was the teaching of the Italian mystic, Joachim of Fiore. This 12th century abbot had developed a revolutionary concept of history, dividing it into three eras: the era of the Father, the Old Testament; the era of the Son, the New Testament and the age of the Church; and the coming era of the Holy Spirit. According to his calculations, this third era was about to dawn, and it would be an age of pure knowledge and spiritual insight, when the hierarchical church would become unnecessary, and people would communicate directly with God by understanding his creation. This idea, though condemned as heresy, captured the minds of many 13th century intellectuals and mystics, especially within the Franciscan Order. For a man of Bacon's temperament, it was incredibly appealing. He saw himself not just as a scholar, but as a herald of this new age, one of the spiritual men who were meant to prepare the world for its arrival. His passionate drive to create a universal science was not just an academic interest. He sincerely believed that if all knowledge, mathematics, optics, astronomy, alchemy, linguistics, could be gathered and purged of errors and superstitions, it would be possible to create a tool that would allow humanity to read the book of nature as clearly as it read Holy Scripture. This knowledge, he believed, would become the ultimate weapon in the final battle against the Antichrist, whose arrival many thought was imminent, especially with the Mongol invasion, which was seen as the fulfillment of biblical prophecies about the nations of Gog and Magog. Thus, Bacon's scientific work took on a sacred, almost messianic meaning. He wasn't just studying the properties of light or chemical reactions, he was forging a weapon for the salvation of Christendom. This conviction in his own righteousness and his great mission explains his intolerance for his opponents and his fierce criticism of the existing order. He saw them not as colleagues with a different opinion, but as blind fools obstructing the fulfillment of God's plan, and this belief led him directly into a collision course with those who saw the world very differently. The arena where his unique and unyielding character was forged was in the greatest intellectual centers of the time, the universities of Oxford and Paris. Arriving there as a young man, he threw himself headfirst into the swirling atmosphere of scholastic debate. Scholasticism was the dominant method of learning. It was based on the meticulous analysis of texts by recognized authorities, the Bible, the Church Fathers, and increasingly Aristotle, and the construction of complex logical arguments to answer a particular question. However, Bacon was soon deeply disappointed. He saw the most brilliant minds of his generation wasting years on endless debates about purely abstract matters, such as the nature of universals or whether God could create a stone so heavy that he himself could not lift it. These debates seemed to him to be a sterile game of wits, detached from reality. He saw professors quoting Aristotle without even knowing Greek, or discussing the nature of light without ever having conducted a simple experiment with a lens. It was at this moment that a revolution took place within him. He came to a conclusion that was revolutionary for his time. There are two ways of knowing, through argument and through experience. And while an argument can lead to a conclusion and force us to agree with it, it does not provide the certainty or remove the doubt that direct experience does. Scientia experimentalis, experimental science, became his banner and his weapon. He began to greedily study mathematics, which he called the gateway and the key to all sciences, and optics, which he believed was closest to the divine act of creation. For God had said, "Let there be light." He spent vast sums of his family's money on buying Arabic manuscripts and on creating lenses, mirrors, and astrolabes. He dissected animal eyes to understand the mechanism of vision and studied the properties of saltpeter and sulfur, which would later lead to his description of the composition of gunpowder. This obsession with experiment and his contempt for the armchair science of his contemporaries forged his character. He became sharp, uncompromising, sarcastic, and utterly convinced of his own rightness. He didn't just think he was smarter than others. He believed he had found the one true path to knowledge, while everyone else was wandering in the darkness of ignorance. This intellectual pride, born in the lecture halls of Paris and Oxford, would become the source of his greatest insights and the cause of his deepest fall. Possessing a sharp mind, an unshakable confidence in his own rightness, and a sarcastic tongue, Roger Bacon could not remain in the shadows for long. He did not simply develop his ideas in the quiet of his study. He went on the warpath, and his first targets were the most revered intellectual authorities of his era. In his lectures and writings, he unleashed a merciless critique on men whose names were spoken with reverence in all the universities of Europe. The main targets of his attacks were two pillars of scholasticism: the Dominicans Albertus Magnus and his student, Thomas Aquinas. While all of Europe praised Albertus as Doctor Universalis, the master of all sciences, Bacon publicly declared that he was self-taught, had acquired his knowledge without a proper education, and that his works on the natural sciences were full of the crudest errors that any diligent student could have spotted. He caustically remarked that Albertus wrote about things he had never seen or tested through experience, merely repeating the fallacies of the ancients. Even harsher was his criticism of Thomas Aquinas, whose grand synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy was already considered the pinnacle of scholastic thought. Bacon saw this synthesis not as a triumph, but as a catastrophe. He accused Aquinas of building his magnificent edifice on a rotten foundation, on incorrect translations of Aristotle from Arabic rather than from the Greek original. He argued that before philosophizing, one must master languages and mathematics and then verify everything through experience. These attacks were an act of unheard-of audacity. It was the equivalent of a young graduate student today publicly calling the works of Einstein and Hawking ignorant nonsense. Bacon was making enemies not just among his colleagues, but among entire powerful religious orders. The Dominicans, whose prestige was inextricably linked to the names of Albertus and Thomas, developed a mortal grudge against the insolent Franciscan. But Bacon did not stop. He criticized everyone: professors for their laziness, students for their ignorance, scribes for their errors, preachers for distorting the Bible. He was an intellectual purist who accepted no compromises. This first blood shed in academic battles revealed his main trait and his fatal flaw. He was a genius who was completely incapable of diplomacy. He believed that truth spoke for itself and needed no fancy packaging. He burned all his bridges behind him, not understanding that in a world where power and authority meant more than facts, the naked truth, spoken without respect, is perceived not as a gift, but as an insult. Behind the fierce criticism and the uncompromising fight for scientific truth lay one all-consuming, almost maniacal idea that was both Bacon's guiding star and his inner demon. It wasn't simply a thirst for knowledge or a desire for fame. His secret motivation, his great purpose, was the creation of a comprehensive work he called the opus, or scriptum principal, the principal work. In his vision, this was to be not just an encyclopedia, but something incomparably greater: a universal science, a grand synthesis of absolutely all fields of human knowledge, from theology and philosophy to mathematics, optics, astronomy, alchemy, medicine, and ethics. And all of it was to be based on the three pillars he considered the only reliable ones: a flawless knowledge of languages, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic; to read the original sources, mathematics as the universal language for describing nature, and the experimental verification of any theoretical proposition. Bacon was convinced that the Christendom of his time was sick. It was mired in corruption, ignorance, and superstition. The clergy did not know the languages and misinterpreted the Bible. Theologians engaged in empty rhetoric, and missionaries could not convert the infidels because they could not prove the superiority of their faith through reason. His opus was meant to be the cure for all these diseases. He dreamed that, armed with this knowledge, the Church could reform itself from within and create a new generation of educated priests and missionaries. Moreover, he believed that this universal science would become an irrefutable proof of divine truth, which neither Muslims, nor Jews, nor even the Mongols could resist. He seriously thought it would be possible to create optical instruments, giant mirrors, that could burn enemy armies from a distance, or machines that would inspire awe and reverence in savages. This was not just a scientific program, but a utopian, messianic project to remake the world. This obsession explains everything: his feverish work ethic, his contempt for those who he felt were wasting their time, and his desperate search for a patron who could finance this titanic undertaking. He saw himself not as a mere scholar, but as the architect of the future, the savior of the Christian world. And for the sake of this great goal, he was ready to engage in any conflict, to challenge any authority, and ultimately, to sacrifice his own freedom. At some point around the year 1257, at the age of 43, Roger Bacon takes the most paradoxical and, as it would turn out, fatal step of his life. He joins the Franciscan Order. At first glance, this decision seems illogical. Why would a brilliant and wealthy scholar, accustomed to intellectual freedom and comfort, voluntarily don the coarse habit of a mendicant friar and take vows of poverty, chastity, and, most terrifyingly for him, obedience? His motives were likely complex. Perhaps he felt a genuine religious impulse, a desire to unite his scientific work with service to God. The Franciscans, unlike the more conservative Dominicans, were considered at the time to be more open to new ideas, and many of them held prominent positions at Oxford. Perhaps Bacon expected that the powerful structure of the order would give him access to the best libraries in Europe, a network of learned correspondence, and protection from attacks by secular authorities. He may have hoped that by becoming part of the system, he could reform it from within, convincing his brothers of the necessity of his universal science. However, the order he had imagined as an ideal laboratory for his research in reality became his future prison. He very quickly encountered the downside of monastic life. The vow of poverty meant he could no longer freely spend his own money on books and instruments. Any expenditure required the permission of his superior, who most often neither understood nor approved of his expensive hobbies. But the most difficult trial was the vow of obedience. His rebellious nature, his habit of speaking the truth to power and criticizing authorities, were now considered not virtues, but the sins of pride and insubordination. He was required to submit to men he often considered ignorant and narrow-minded. The Franciscan Order became a golden cage for him. It gave him a certain status and protection, but it deprived him of the one thing that mattered most: freedom. This internal conflict between his vocation as a scholar and his duty as a monk would grow with each passing year. He tried to serve two masters, truth as he understood it, and his superiors. And this contradiction would eventually tear his life in two. Despite growing difficulties within the order, fate seemed to smile on Bacon. In the 1260s, during his time in Paris, he met a man who, for a brief period, would become his greatest hope and his shield. This man was Cardinal Guy de Foulques, the papal legate to France and England. Unlike many church hierarchs of the time, de Foulques was a man of broad horizons, inquisitive and open to new ideas. He was not a scholar, but he possessed a rare quality for a man of power: the ability to recognize genius. During his meetings with Bacon, he was captivated by the scale of his vision and the depth of his knowledge. While Bacon's superiors in the order saw only a troublesome and insubordinate monk, the cardinal saw in him a potential instrument for strengthening and reforming the church. He became interested in the idea of a universal science and asked Bacon to set down his thoughts in writing. For Bacon, this was a breath of fresh air. For the first time in years, he had met someone at the very pinnacle of power who did not condemn, but encouraged him. He saw in the cardinal the very patron he had been searching for his whole life, a man who could understand and support his grand project. A correspondence full of hopes and plans began between them. Bacon believed his hour had come. He was confident that with such support, he could overcome the resistance of his conservative superiors and finally get the resources and freedom to create his opus. This alliance between a disgraced intellectual monk and a powerful prince of the church was fragile, held together solely by personal sympathy. But as long as the cardinal was alive and powerful, Bacon felt safe. He did not yet know that this hope, like a bright comet, would streak across the sky of his life and vanish as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving him in even greater darkness and solitude than before. This short period of patronage became the highest point of his career, which would inevitably be followed by a swift and terrible fall. Roger Bacon's finest hour came in February of 1265. The news from Perugia was like a thunderclap. His patron, Cardinal Guy de Fulk, had been elected the new pope, taking the name Clement IV. For Bacon, this was more than just good news. It was a miracle, a divine intervention, a confirmation of his righteousness. Now, on the throne of St. Peter, sat a man who knew of his ideas, valued them, and most importantly, could give him a command that would override any prohibition from his order. And that command wasn't long in coming. In a letter dated June 22, 1266, Pope Clement IV, referring to their previous conversations, asked Bacon to, in spite of any prohibitions from his superiors, secretly compile and send him a comprehensive account of his philosophical and scientific ideas. This was the moment of truth. On the one hand, a direct order from the Vicar of Christ on earth, the chance of a lifetime, the opportunity to bring his ideas to the very top and perhaps change the course of history. On the other, it was an act of flagrant disobedience. About 6 years earlier, in 1260, the general chapter of the Franciscans in Narbonne, presided over by Bonaventure, had issued a strict decree forbidding any friar of the order from writing or distributing books without the prior permission of the minister general. Violating this ban was punished severely, with imprisonment on a diet of bread and water. Bacon was caught between a rock and a hard place. To obey the Pope meant betraying his order and incurring the wrath of his direct superiors. To obey the order meant disobeying the Pope and burying his life's work. This choice was not just a tactical decision, it was a strategic miscalculation of colossal proportions. Blinded by the opportunity before him, Bacon underestimated the depth of hostility he had already aroused in his superiors and the fragility of the Pope's own power, as he was an old and sick man. He bet on one man against an entire system. And, as the future would show, he bet on the wrong horse. The decision he made in that moment became his greatest triumph and his fatal mistake, setting in motion a chain of events that would inexorably lead him to a prison cell. While Bacon received an almost divine sanction from the Pope, his greatest enemy was already in a key position to undermine all his efforts. This enemy was not some ignorant inquisitor, but one of the greatest minds of the era, the general of the Franciscan Order, the philosopher and theologian Giovanni di Fidanza, better known as Saint Bonaventure. Their conflict was not just a personal dislike. It was a fundamental battle between two worldviews, two paths to knowing God. Bonaventure, known as the Seraphic Doctor, was a representative of traditional Augustinian mysticism. He believed that the highest truth is attained not through logic or experiment, but through prayer, divine illumination, and love for God. The path to knowledge, in his view, lay in the purification of the soul. He considered the sciences based on observing the material world to be, at best, useful but secondary, and at worst, dangerous, as they distract the mind from its main purpose, the contemplation of God, and lead to pride. Bacon, on the other hand, was a fervent advocate of the new Aristotelian approach. He argued that the path to understanding the Creator lay through studying his creation. Mathematics, optics, and astronomy were not just sciences to him, but steps on a ladder leading to God. He believed in the power of reason and experience, while Bonaventure believed in the power of faith and humility. Their conflict was exacerbated by their personal styles. Bonaventure was a systemic thinker, a builder of order, a man who sought to strengthen discipline and unity within the sprawling order. Bacon was a rebel, an individualist, whose behavior and criticism undermined authority and hierarchy. When Bonaventure issued the ban on writing books, he was likely targeting precisely people like Bacon, too smart, too independent, and too loud. He saw in Bacon's fascination with alchemy, astrology, and suspicious novelties a direct threat to the purity of Franciscan spirituality. Thus, on the chessboard of the 13th century, a deadly game was set for Bacon. On one side, a powerful but distant and ailing patron in Rome. On the other, his direct superior, one of the most influential men in the church, who was his ideological antagonist and had all the levers of power to control his every move. It was a clash not just of two men, but of two worlds, and Bacon was caught right on the fault line. Upon receiving the letter from Pope Clement IV, Roger Bacon found himself at the main crossroads of his life. His entire past, all his research, disputes, and hopes had converged on this single moment, on one fateful decision. Two paths lay before him, both fraught with immense risk. The first path was the path of obedience. He could have written a reply to the Pope, citing the strict prohibition of his order, and humbly declined the request. This would have been the safe, cautious move. He would have maintained good relations with his superiors, avoided accusations of insubordination, and perhaps lived out the rest of his days in peace, continuing his research quietly, without publishing. But for a man with his ambitions and his belief in his messianic mission, this was equivalent to spiritual suicide. It would have meant betraying his life's work, giving up the only chance to bring his ideas to the world and initiate the reform he dreamed of. To remain silent now, when the Pope himself was asking him to speak, was unthinkable. The second path was the path of bold defiance. He could ignore Bonaventure's ban, relying on the Pope's authority as the higher law. This was a path of enormous risk. He knew full well that his superiors in the order would see it as a rebellion and a challenge to their power. He knew that if the Pope died or lost interest in him, he would be left alone to face his powerful enemies, and then the reckoning would be inevitable. It was a gamble, an all-or-nothing bet. And Bacon, true to his nature as a rebel and a visionary, chose the second path. Blinded by the greatness of his goal and his conviction in his own rightness, he decided the game was worth the candle. He began to work. In secret from his superiors, in a feverish hurry, aware that his patron's time might be running out, he started creating the work that was to become his ultimate justification and his greatest legacy. This decision, made in the solitude of a monastery cell, became a turning point not only in his life, but perhaps in the history of science. He chose the path of a genius, not a saint, the path of a martyr for science, not an obedient monk. And this choice predetermined the rest of his tragic journey. What happened next is one of the most astonishing intellectual feats in human history. Having received the papal letter and made his fateful choice, Roger Bacon plunged into his work with superhuman energy. He was obsessed, understanding that his window of opportunity could slam shut at any moment. In an incredibly short period of time, about 1 year between late 1266 and early 1268, he, almost single-handedly, without adequate funds and in the strictest secrecy, created not one, but 3 monumental works that are known today as his great triple opus. The first and most important was the Opus Majus, great work, a colossal volume of nearly 800 pages in which he laid out his entire program for the reform of education and science. In it, he argued that true knowledge was impossible without the study of foreign languages, mathematics, optics, astronomy, and experimental science. It was here that he described in detail the laws of refraction and reflection of light, and explained the principles of magnifying glasses, laying the groundwork for the invention of eyeglasses, telescopes, and microscopes. It was here that he, with astonishing foresight, predicted future inventions. He wrote, "Machines may be made by which the largest ships, with only one man steering them, will be moved faster than if they were full of rowers. Also, cars may be made so that without a draft animal, they may be moved with unimaginable speed. And flying machines may be constructed so that a man sits in the midst of the machine, turning some engine by which artificial wings are made to beat the air like a flying bird." The second was the Opus Minus, lesser work, written as a summary and supplement to the first in case it got lost on its way. The third was the Opus Tertium, third work, another supplement containing autobiographical details and a fierce critique of his contemporaries. This titanic labor was the pinnacle of his genius, his moment of absolute triumph. He believed that by sending these books to Rome, he had fulfilled his mission, that the Pope, upon reading them, would immediately begin the reforms, and that the world would never be the same. This was his moment of greatest pride, his hubris. He had challenged the entire intellectual system of his time, confident that his genius and his patron would protect him from any consequences. He was on top of the world, not noticing that the ground beneath his feet was already beginning to crumble. In sending his works to Rome, Bacon made another tactical error that worsened his situation. He did not limit himself to presenting his scientific ideas. True to his uncompromising character, he filled the pages of his books with a fierce and merciless critique of the entire existing order. His opus was not just a scientific treatise, but an indictment aimed at all the pillars of medieval society. He attacked the universities, calling them markets of error, where professors who knew neither Greek nor Arabic taught a distorted version of Aristotle, and students wasted years on meaningless sophistry. He assaulted his fellow friars and the clergy in general, accusing them of moral decay, greed, hypocrisy, and, worst of all, profound ignorance. He wrote that many priests could not even read the Latin text of the Mass correctly, let alone interpret the Holy Scripture, their knowledge of which they replaced with quoting from collections of sermons. He did not spare the highest leadership of the Church, indirectly hinting at the corruption and simony reigning in the papal curia. For him, this criticism was inseparable from his scientific program. He genuinely believed that in order to build the new edifice of universal science, it was first necessary to demolish the old, rotten structure to its foundations. But to his enemies, and even to potential allies, this came across as an act of incredible pride and arrogance. Who was he, this simple monk, to judge the entire church, all scholars, and all his superiors? He was sending the Pope not just a request for support, but an ultimatum, the manifesto of a reformer who placed himself above the entire existing system. These furious invectives, scattered throughout the pages of his brilliant works, became the first cracks in his armor. They transformed him from a misunderstood genius into a dangerous troublemaker. They gave his enemies the perfect weapon. Now they could accuse him not of questionable scientific theories, but of undermining the authority of the Church and insulting its spiritual leaders. He himself had piled the wood for the pyre upon which he would be burned, albeit metaphorically for now. The fatal blow that turned all of Bacon's triumphs to ash and made his fall inevitable came not from a monastery cell or a university lecture hall, but from the papal apartments in Viterbo. On November 29, 1268, Pope Clement IV died after a short illness. For the rest of Europe, this was important, but routine news. Popes died, and new ones were elected. But for Roger Bacon, it was a catastrophe. Clement's death was not just the loss of a patron, it was the collapse of his entire life strategy. His only shield, the man whose authority he had used to defy the rules of his order, was gone. Bacon found himself in the position of a general who, in the midst of a decisive battle, suddenly discovers that his army has vanished, leaving him alone and unarmed, surrounded by enemies. His great works, the Opus Majus, Minus, and Tertium, which he had created with such effort and risk and sent to Rome, now lay on a desk in the papal chancery, not as a brilliant revelation, but as material evidence of his crime. They were irrefutable proof of his dual sin. First, flagrant disobedience to the order's rule forbidding the writing of books without permission, and second, the unheard-of audacity of his criticism of the entire ecclesiastical and academic hierarchy. While Clement was alive, this had been an act of service to the Holy See. Now, after his death, it became an act of rebellion against his lawful superiors. To make matters worse, after Clement's death, the papal throne remained vacant for nearly 3 years, the longest interregnum in history. During this power vacuum, his enemies within the Franciscan Order were given a free hand. They no longer had to look over their shoulders toward Rome. They could finally settle the score with the hated upstart. His moment of greatest hope had turned into his moment of absolute vulnerability. He had set a flywheel in motion that he could no longer stop, but the driver who could have guided it in his favor was suddenly dead. From that moment on, Roger Bacon's fall was only a matter of time. With the death of Pope Clement IV, the political and intellectual climate within the Franciscan Order began to change rapidly, and the wind blew in the most unfavorable direction for Bacon. The power of his chief antagonist, the general of the order, Bonaventure, reached its zenith. Bonaventure, seeing the growing influence of Aristotelian philosophy, which he considered a Trojan horse of rationalism and atheism within Christianity, began a systematic campaign to eradicate dangerous ideas. He and his supporters initiated a veritable purge within the order, targeting those who, like Bacon, were too engrossed in secular sciences, Arabic authors, astrology, and alchemy. Bacon's ideas, as laid out in his opus, became a perfect target. His emphasis on experiment and experience as the ultimate criterion of truth diminished the role of faith and the authority of Holy Scripture. His interest in astrology, though he tried to separate scientific astrology from divinatory fortune-telling, bordered on fatalism and the denial of human free will, a cornerstone of Christian doctrine. His pursuits in alchemy, aimed at finding the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, could easily be portrayed as sorcery and an attempt to interfere with divine providence. In this atmosphere of growing suspicion and conservatism, Bacon transformed from a merely eccentric scholar into a symbol of everything Bonaventure was fighting against. He was the living embodiment of intellectual pride, dangerous free-thinking, and insubordination. A long game began. Bacon was not condemned immediately. That would have been too crude and might have raised questions. Instead, they began to methodically isolate him. In 1271, he was recalled from Oxford, where he had students and supporters, and placed under strict supervision in Paris, the main stronghold of conservative theology, where his ideas had long been met with sharp disapproval. It was a well-calculated move to tear him from his familiar environment, deprive him of support, and place him in the very heart of the enemy camp, where his every word and step would be watched by dozens of hostile eyes. The walls were slowly but inexorably closing in around him. The transfer to Paris was merely a prelude to the real disaster. In the 1270s, a powerful conservative reaction swept across Europe, especially in its intellectual capital, Paris, a kind of witch hunt within the academic world. Church authorities, frightened by the overly bold conclusions that some philosophers were drawing from the works of Aristotle and his Arab commentators like Averroes, decided to strike back. The culmination of this reaction was the famous Paris Condemnations of 1277. On March 7th, the Bishop of Paris, Étienne Tempier, acting on the instructions of Pope John XXI, published a list of 219 theses that were henceforth declared heretical and forbidden to be taught under threat of excommunication. This list was a veritable powder keg. It mixed genuinely radical Averroist ideas, such as the eternity of the world, the denial of creation out of nothing, and a single soul for all humanity, with propositions that directly or indirectly touched upon Roger Bacon's work. For example, it condemned theses stating that the future could be predicted through astrology, that the actions of celestial bodies necessarily predetermine human actions, and that the experimental method is the only source of certain knowledge. Although Bacon's name was not mentioned in the list, the blow was perfectly aimed. The atmosphere in Paris became suffocating. Any deviation from strict orthodoxy, any interest in astrology, alchemy, or even just empirical research could now be interpreted as sympathy for the condemned heresies. For Bacon's enemies, this was a gift from fate. They now had not just suspicions, but a formal, almost papal, condemnation of the very suspicious novelties they had long accused him of. The clouds that had been gathering over his head for so long finally broke in a storm. The condemnations of 1277 created the perfect legal and ideological background to finally deal with the inconvenient and overly clever monk. His fate was sealed. In the wake of the Paris condemnations, Bacon's enemies delivered the decisive blow. In 1278, a general chapter, the Supreme Assembly of the Franciscan Order, was held in Paris. It was presided over by the new general of the order, Jerome of Ascoli, a man of rigid conservative views and a faithful follower of Bonaventure's policies. Bonaventure himself had died 4 years earlier. Jerome was the man to finish the purge his predecessor had started. At this chapter, Roger Bacon was officially condemned. The verdict was not delivered by a secular court or the Papal Inquisition, which would have been a loud and scandalous process. No, he was tried and convicted by his own brothers, the members of his own spiritual family. It was a quiet, internal reckoning, which made it all the more cruel. The sentence was harsh: life imprisonment in a monastery prison, and a strict prohibition on any scientific or writing activity. He was to be silenced forever. The execution of the sentence was overseen by Jerome of Ascoli himself, which gave it particular weight. This man was no random figure. 10 years later, in 1288, he would become Pope himself, under the name Nicholas IV. This means that Bacon's condemnation was sanctioned at the highest level within the order by a man who would soon hold absolute power in the Catholic world. This ensured that the verdict would not be reviewed for years to come. Bacon was transferred from Paris to a monastery in Ancona on the Adriatic coast of Italy. The choice of location was not accidental. It was far from his native England and from the intellectual centers of Oxford and Paris, where he might still have had supporters. He was sent into exile, into oblivion. The dream of creating a universal science that would save the Christian world had turned into the nightmare of solitary confinement. The man who wanted to give humanity wings was himself put in a cage. The official wording of the charge brought against Bacon was deliberately vague and obscure. He was condemned for certain suspicious novelties, propter quasdam novitats suspectus. This legal ambiguity was not accidental, but a brilliantly calculated tactic by his accusers. If they had accused him of a specific heresy, such as denying the Trinity or the divinity of Christ, Bacon, being a brilliant theologian and debater, could have easily demolished those charges in a formal disputation. He could have appealed to the Pope, demanded a commission be convened, and the process would have dragged on for years, turning into a major scandal that the Order's leadership did not want. The phrase suspicious novelties was far more insidious. It allowed them to avoid a substantive debate on the merit of his ideas. Anything could be swept under this charge: his fascination with Arab science, his alchemical experiments, which to the ignorant looked like magic, his astrological predictions, which could be interpreted as fatalism, and his revolutionary ideas in optics and mathematics, which simply no one understood. But in truth, he was not condemned for these things. His real crimes, hidden behind this vague phrase, were something else entirely. First, it was flagrant insubordination. He had violated a direct and clear ban from his order on writing books. Second, it was pride and insult to authority. His merciless criticism of Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, and the entire academic system was taken as a personal affront and an undermining of corporate honor. Third, it was his association with the wrong people and fascination with the wrong ideas at the worst possible moment, when the pendulum of the intellectual climate had swung toward conservatism. He was punished not for predicting airplanes and automobiles. In the 13th century, most people saw these ideas as the ravings of a madman and not a real threat. He was punished for being a genius with an unbearable character, a rebel who tried to break the system single-handedly. He was condemned not for heresy, but for being inconvenient. The system simply ejected a foreign body that was irritating and destabilizing it. The journey from Paris to Ancona was, for Roger Bacon, a journey into hell. For 14 years, from 1278 to 1292, he remained in confinement. The exact conditions of his imprisonment are unknown, but judging by the practices of the time for errant monks, they were extremely harsh. A monastery prison was not just a loss of freedom. It was the complete and methodical destruction of a person, especially for someone like Bacon. Imagine his world, suddenly shrunk to the size of a stone cell. He was deprived of the very things that gave his life meaning: books, parchment, ink, astrolabes, lenses. For a scholar whose mind was accustomed to roaming the entire universe, this was the most sophisticated form of torture. His eyes, which had studied the rainbow and dissected the structure of an ox's eye, could now see only gray stones and a strip of sky in a narrow window. His hands, which had mixed chemical elements and drawn complex geometric figures, could now only finger a rosary. His voice, which had thundered in the lecture halls of Oxford and Paris, could now only whisper the obligatory prayers. It was a sensory and intellectual starvation designed to break his spirit. He was completely cut off from the world. News did not reach him. He did not know how the sciences were developing, what new books were being written, what political events were taking place. He was buried alive. These 14 years became the lost years in the history of science. We will never know what other discoveries his brilliant mind could have made if he had been free. What other insights about the future might he have put on paper? Perhaps it was during these years that he could have systematized his knowledge, written his final, completed opus. But instead, his mind was forced to idle, in a vacuum. This tragedy of Bacon is not just his personal tragedy. It is a tragedy for all of humanity, which for 14 years, and perhaps for centuries, was deprived of the fruits of one of the greatest minds in its history. While Bacon slowly faded in his Ancona dungeon, the world outside its walls moved on, and the memory of him was gradually erased, distorted, and transformed into a dark legend. The intellectual mainstream that he had so fiercely criticized won a complete victory. The synthesis of Thomas Aquinas, which Bacon had considered to be built on errors, became the official philosophy of the Catholic Church. Thomas's name was surrounded with growing reverence, and just 50 years after his death, he was canonized, declared a saint. Bonaventure, Bacon's main ideological opponent, was also canonized and proclaimed a doctor of the Church. Their works were studied in all universities. Their authority was unassailable. Against this backdrop, the name of Roger Bacon, if it was remembered at all, was spoken only in whispers and with a tinge of fear. From the wonderful doctor, he was transformed into a legendary sorcerer, a magician and alchemist who was justly punished for his dealings with dark forces. Popular rumor attributed to him the creation of a talking brazen head that could predict the future, and other miracles bordering on the diabolical. This transformation of his image was advantageous to his persecutors. It completely discredited him as a scholar and thinker. Why argue with his ideas about optics or mathematics when you could simply declare him a sorcerer? The legend of Dr. Faustus, who sold his soul to the devil for knowledge, grew in large part from the distorted biography of Roger Bacon. Thus, the system not only isolated him physically, it destroyed his reputation, replacing the image of a visionary genius with the caricature of an evil wizard. This was the final oblivion. The world he had tried to enlighten chose to forget him and replace him with a frightening fairy tale. The irony of his fate was that the man who believed more than anything in the power of reason and light would remain in the popular memory as a character from a world of darkness and superstition. Time passed. Bacon's main persecutors died. Power in the order and in the Vatican changed hands. And although the official sentence was never overturned, the sharp edge of hostility toward the old prisoner gradually dulled. New generations of Franciscans and church leaders no longer remembered the details of that long-ago conflict. Bacon's release required not a review of his case, but a convergence of favorable circumstances and the appearance of people willing to intercede for him. And such people were found, influential English nobles and churchmen who remembered their great, albeit disgraced, countrymen, played an important role in his fate by petitioning for his release. But the decisive factor was a change in leadership within the Franciscan Order itself. In 1289, a new general of the order was elected, Raymond Goffredi, a man of a completely different disposition than his predecessors, Bonaventure and Jerome of Ascoli. Goffredi was a representative of the spirituals, a movement within Franciscanism that advocated a return to the original austerity and poverty bequeathed by St. Francis. He was known for his interest in mystical and prophetic teachings, including the ideas of Joachim of Fiore, which, as we remember, were also close to Bacon's heart. According to legend, during a visit to the Ancona monastery, Goffredi personally visited Bacon's prison cell. He was struck not so much by the old man's physical condition as by the clarity and strength of his unbroken mind. Goffredi, unlike his predecessors, did not see a threat in Bacon's ideas. On the contrary, he may have recognized in him a kindred spirit, another seeker of truth, unjustly condemned for his boldness of thought. It was his intervention that proved decisive. He used his authority as general of the order to secure Bacon's release. The process wasn't quick. It required overcoming the inertia of the bureaucratic machine. But the ice had finally begun to break. After 14 years of near total silence and oblivion, a faint ray of hope glimmered. In the year 1292, after long efforts and the intercession of the new leadership of the order and English nobles, the unbelievable happened. The door of the Ancona dungeon opened for the last time, and Roger Bacon walked free. He was about 78 years old, a very old man by 13th century standards. 14 years of imprisonment had left their indelible mark on him. He was physically exhausted, his body broken by years spent in damp and cold. But his spirit, his intellect, remained untouched. The prison had not been able to extinguish the inner fire that had burned in him his whole life. He stepped out into the light, squinting in the unaccustomed brightness of the sun, and saw a world that had changed greatly. Most of his friends and enemies were already dead. Science, though slowly, had moved forward, and there were new names and new ideas. He was a living ghost from the past. He was allowed to return to his homeland, to Oxford, the very place where his scientific career had begun. It was an act of mercy from the Order's new leadership. They were sending the old man back to die where his heart was. But Bacon had no intention of dying in peace. He did not see his release as a cause for gratitude or humility. On the contrary, he saw it as his last chance to tell the world what he had not had time to say, to finish what he had not been allowed to finish. He returned to Oxford, not to quietly live out his days, but to fight his final battle. The world he had left was the world of his prime. The world to which he returned was already a different era. But his mind, tempered in silence and solitude, remained as sharp and uncompromising as ever. He was ready for the final act of his tragic drama. The return to Oxford became the most astonishing and ironic finale in the story of Roger Bacon. Any other man in his place, after surviving 14 years of hell, would have devoted the rest of his days to prayer and penance. But not Bacon. In him, there was not a shadow of remorse, not a drop of humility. As soon as he gained access to parchment and ink, he set to work with the same untamable energy. He began to write his final unfinished work, the Compendium Studii Theologiae, a compendium of the study of theology. And this work became his true testament, his final challenge to the world. Instead of thanking his liberators or trying to smooth over old conflicts, he attacked with renewed vigor everything for which he had been condemned. He once again fiercely criticized theologians for their ignorance, for their lack of knowledge of languages and the natural sciences. He ridiculed the logical toys of the scholastics with the same sarcasm. He argued again that the only path to a true understanding of God lay through mathematics and experience. There was no senile fatigue in this final work. It rang with the same powerful, self-assured voice of a prophet and reformer. Prison had not broken him. It had not changed his convictions one bit. On the contrary, the years spent in contemplation had only strengthened his belief in his own rightness. This final act of defiance is the strongest argument that he was condemned, not for heresy. A heretic, to save his life or gain his freedom, would have recanted his views. Bacon, however, as soon as he was out of his cage, began to do exactly the same thing for which he had been put in it. He was not a heretic, but a rebel to the core, a man for whom intellectual honesty was more important than his own safety and freedom. His last, unfinished work is a monument to an unyielding will and loyalty to one's ideals. He proved that you can imprison the body of a genius, but you cannot imprison his thought. About 2 years after his release, around the year 1294, Roger Bacon died in Oxford. He died quietly and in near obscurity, surrounded by a small circle of devoted students who dared to associate with the former prisoner. There was no grand funeral, no laudatory speeches. He was buried in the church of the Franciscan Friary in Oxford as a simple monk, one among many. The man whose mind spanned centuries, who foresaw the future of technology and dreamed of a global reform of knowledge, passed from this life without leaving behind either great fame or official recognition. His death closed the tragic circle of his life. He began his journey as a brilliant and promising scholar, reached a peak when he communicated directly with the Pope, and was then cast into the abyss of oblivion, only to return briefly at the very end of his life and die almost unnoticed. His passing symbolized the final victory of the system he had tried to change. It had ground him up, spit him out, and forgotten him. His books were either hidden away under lock and key in monastery libraries or simply consigned to oblivion. For many centuries, his name became synonymous not with a brilliant scientist, but with a dangerous sorcerer. The curtain fell. History, it seemed, had delivered its verdict. The rebel was defeated, order was restored. But the death of a physical body is not always the end of the story. Sometimes, it is merely the beginning of a long journey to immortality. The seeds that Bacon had sown in his works did not perish. They simply lay dormant in the earth, waiting for their time, waiting for a new spring when the intellectual climate would change and they could finally sprout. The legacy of Roger Bacon is a story of the longest and most paradoxical echo in the history of thought. Immediately after his death, an unspoken but effective ban was placed on his works and his name. For nearly 3 centuries during the late Middle Ages, he was practically erased from official intellectual history. If he was remembered at all, it was only in the context of legends about magic and sorcery. However, his manuscripts, hidden in the depths of monastery libraries, were not destroyed. They were waiting for their moment. And that moment came during the Renaissance and the scientific revolution that followed. In the 16th and 17th centuries, when the pendulum of history swung in the opposite direction, and the cult of experience, experiment, and reason replaced scholastic dogma, Bacon's name was rediscovered. The scientists and philosophers of the new era, reading his miraculously preserved manuscripts, were stunned. They discovered that 300 or 400 years before them, there had lived a man who spoke their language. His call for experimental science, his belief in the power of mathematics, his criticism of blind veneration of authority, all of it sounded incredibly modern. He became a banner for them, a symbol, and the first scientist in the modern sense of the word. The icons of the scientific revolution saw him as their direct predecessor. Another great Englishman, Francis Bacon, no relation, just a shared surname, who is considered one of the fathers of empiricism, built much of his philosophy on ideas that resonated with Rogers. Leonardo da Vinci, the genius of the Renaissance, seemed to bring Bacon's prophecies of flying machines and optical devices to life with his inventions and research. Thus, Bacon became a martyr for science, a man born too early who suffered for the truth. He lost the battle in his own century, but he won the war for his place in history. His tragedy became his triumph, and his legacy proved that great ideas, even when they are buried, have the power to be resurrected. So, we return to the main question posed at the very beginning. Why did a monk scientist who predicted the invention of airplanes and cars spend 14 years in prison? Now, having traced his entire life path, we can give a final, multi-layered answer that reveals the full tragedy of his paradox. He was imprisoned not for his brilliant insights about the future. For most of his contemporaries, these predictions, scattered throughout his works, were merely strange fantasies. not a real threat. His tragedy was the result of a perfect storm, a fatal convergence of 5 key factors. The first, and perhaps most important, was his unbearable, uncompromising character. He was an intellectual snob who could not and would not be a diplomat, making enemies at every turn with his caustic criticism. The second factor was direct disobedience. By obeying the Pope's order, he violated the statutes of his own order, which in the eyes of his superiors was a mortal sin, an act of rebellion that demanded an exemplary punishment. Third was the loss of his patron. The death of Pope Clement IV, at the most critical moment, deprived him of his only shield and left him alone to face a hostile system. The fourth factor was bad timing. His boldest ideas and criticisms coincided with a period of conservative reaction in the church and universities, a wave of condemnations of dangerous novelties that he fit perfectly. And finally, the fifth factor was the very nature of his knowledge. He mixed revolutionary science, optics, mathematics in the same pot with disciplines that aroused great suspicion: alchemy and astrology. This volatile mixture made him vulnerable and allowed his enemies to easily label him a sorcerer and a heretic. Thus, Bacon's paradox is resolved as follows: he was imprisoned not because his mind was too strong, but because his position within the system was too weak. His tragedy is not that of a pure scientist who suffered for scientific truth, but that of a systemic reformer who tried to overturn a giant and inert corporation single-handedly, without political support, and with a terrible personality. The system crushed him not because it was afraid of his airplanes, but because he broke its rules, insulted its leaders, and challenged its very existence. The story of Roger Bacon, piercing through 7 centuries of history, brings us one eternal and uncomfortable lesson. Being right is not enough, and being right too early is fatally dangerous. His life is not just a biographical entry in a textbook. It is an archetypal story of the eternal struggle between a lone visionary genius and a conservative, self-preserving system, be it the church, the state, or the scientific community. Bacon was a man of the future, trapped in the present. He spoke the language of experiment and evidence to a world that only understood the language of authority and quotation. He tried to light a candle of knowledge in an age that feared, above all, that this light would expose its own imperfections. His tragedy forces us to reflect on the very nature of progress. It does not happen smoothly or linearly. More often, it moves in fits and starts, through sacrifices, through the tragedies of people like Bacon, who pay with their lives and their freedom to push the boundaries of the possible. His story is an eternal reminder to those in power that the most dangerous heresy is not the one that disputes dogmas, but the one that asks inconvenient questions and proposes new answers. And for all of us living today, it poses a troubling, existential question that goes far beyond the 13th century. We love to celebrate the geniuses of the past, to name streets and universities after them. But how do we treat the geniuses of the present? How many modern-day Roger Bacons are right now being ostracized, defunded, denied tenure, or simply ignored because their ideas are too radical, their personalities too inconvenient, and their discoveries threaten the established order of things? The story of the wonderful doctor did not end in 1294. It repeats itself again and again, in every laboratory, in every lecture hall, in every boardroom where a new, bold thought collides with old, entrenched power. And the ultimate question he leaves us with is whether we, after 700 years, have finally learned to tell the prophets from the heretics before it is too late.